Hello, everybody, and welcome to Scary Stories to Tell from the Rez. I'm your host, Jordan, and I want to welcome all of my new listeners and thank you all for coming out to support this brand new podcast that I've started and kicked off. And you're probably asking yourself, what are we doing here? What did I get myself into? Well, Scary Stories to Tell from the Rez is a podcast where we talk about the things that we were told as kids not to talk about, which is the scary stories. And where from? The reservation. The Rez. And you're probably asking yourself, why? Well, because we all know that's where the true scary stories really happen. So come sit down with me by the glow of the fire as we take stories from you, the audience, the listeners, and we'll talk about those stories. We'll read them out loud, or even sometimes listen to you tell your story. And you get to talk about what you've seen, what you heard, and what you were feeling. And following the story, we'll actually sit down and talk about what it is that it could be, what it might be, and talk about urban legends, the myths, or just the scary stuff that is out there. Now, we were told as kids never to talk about these things, but I figure, why not? Because, like I said, the true scary stuff happens right here on the Rez. And I have a few stories of my own, but we'll get into that later. We'll be aiming the show talking about everybody's experiences from the reservation. If you've ever lived on the reservation, been around the reservation, been on a reservation, whether you're native, indigenous, tribal, non-tribal, I want to hear your stories. I want to hear everything that happened. Give me the gory details. Well, at least the scary ones. And we'll kick off the show today with our very first story of the evening. So let's dive right into it with our first story of the show. The inaugural episode, as I like to call it. Now, this story comes from a friend of mine, that lives local. Her name is Casey. And the story goes as followed. Hi, Jordan. So when I was in high school, I worked at the movie theater. I gave a coworker a ride home after work one night. She lived on the Ute Rez, adjacent to Skinwalker Ranch. Well, I dropped her off on the dirt road at her farmhouse, and I started slowly back towards Ballard. It was about 11 p.m. and pitch black. My house is about 5 miles west of Skinwalker Ranch, so I was very near the south part of Skinwalker Ranch when it happened. I was driving down the road when I noticed 2 baby deer in the middle of the road. I stopped the car, and one of the fawns came around my driver's side window, even though it was the middle of the night. And it was weird that there was no mother deer. I stopped my car and manually rolled down my window. One of the deer came around to my window, and so I stuck my arm out to try to pet the deer. Well, I reached out, looking at the driver's window, completely stopped with my foot on the brake, when suddenly, my car jolted back like it'd been hit by a bus. The force came from where the other deer should have been, but now it looked like a humanoid dark shadow. A figure with no eyes or no features. I screamed, and I manually rolled up my window and drove home as fast as I could. When I got home, I looked, and there was no dent on the car, even though it definitely was a big collision, and there should have been some kind of dent. Well, I went inside and told my parents, but they didn't believe me. The end. Thanks, Casey. Well, to give a little insight as to where I'm from and who I am, I actually grew up on the Northern Ute Indian Reservation in Utah, which is exactly right where Skinwalker Ranch is located. So it's not uncommon to hear a lot of stories surrounding this phenomenon known as Skinwalker Ranch. And I think that what Casey experienced definitely had something to do with possibly a shapeshifter or something even more malevolent. And the fact that there was no sign definitely raises a lot more questions. Definitely look forward to hearing more stories from you. Our next story is from a friend of mine. Now, I'd been working in the oil field right here on the Ute Reservation for a long time. And you see a lot of things out here. Well, I'll let Tony tell his story.
Reservation, so I think it's the Uinta Ouray Reservation, I believe it is. So I was over working in the oil fields over that way. Me and you haul water, so you got a general idea of where I'm talking about. It's over there by those locations way back in the field down by the river. When we go into that field, you go down them steep dugways all the way back in there, and they have those locations out in the pitch black dark of night in the middle of nowhere. I was back in there I've worked, before I started doing the job I'm doing now, I was a water hauler, and I hauled water for like 8.5 years. Working in the dark was not a big deal for me. Never has been. I'm at work right now in the dark. But out there, the weirdest thing that ever happened to me was I lost time. And it was really weird the way I lost time, because on the way to the location, it was dark. It was like around this time of night, as a matter of fact. Maybe an hour later or so. So it's like 10:55 right now. Maybe I'll say closer to midnight. Heading down there, and all of a sudden things were just different. It's hard to explain. Like some people say the hair on the back of their neck rises. It wasn't like that. It was more of an altered perception is the best way I can explain it. I never thought in a million years I would explain something like that. But was heading down, got all the way out there, middle of nowhere, in the dark. Only light I have is my work lights on my truck. And I remember it feeling weird. I remember getting out of the truck. But from getting out of the truck, I remember going up, engaging the tank to get my top gauge. The last thing I remember was getting my bottom gauge and coming down. And I literally stopped at the back of the truck. Now, a lot of guys, when they haul water, they have a little notepad, they write their gauges down. Typically I can remember my gauges off the top of my head for that location while I'm doing that work. So I never had to do that. But while I'm sitting there calculating how much I loaded, I looked at the time, and it felt wrong. And I looked around, and it was off, but it was only off about 15 minutes, but it felt, I kid you not, it felt like an hour. It went by somewhere where I had lost anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour. I don't remember gauging the tank. I don't remember none of the steps that a water hauler would normally take. I don't remember doing those steps in between the top gauge and the bottom gauge, literally. And I was so in shock of how the perception of things around me were that I went back up. And I looked back down into the tank. You're not really supposed to look right over the V patch, but I had to see for myself. I didn't think I had pulled that load. And I looked in there, and the load had been pulled, and I just stood there for another 10 minutes, like, what's going on? I looked around the surrounding area as far as I could see in the limitations of the light that I had from my work lights, and it felt like something was there. I didn't hear anything. Now, I've worked out other fields further out in South O'Ray where it's a lot darker, a lot further away from rural civilization where I could get help from someone. And I've heard all kinds of things that go bump in the night, that didn't sound like normal animal sound of things moving, and it didn't bother me. But this silence, I had to say that silence that I felt, and that feeling that something's looking at you and you can't see it. I mean, it's our natural instinct in the dark to want to see what's around you. I mean, even if you're not afraid, you still want to look around and see. And I just something's there. So I rolled my truck up and I made sure my paperwork was right, and I took off. And as I was leaving, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed that the shadows weren't moving right. Typically when you pass something that's in front of you with your headlights, as you pass it, the shadow moves out and around. All my shadows, I kid you not, kept moving forward. Or off to the side of the road, like when you pass sagebrush and gas line markers and stuff like that. Some of those signs they have out there letting you know about certain things on locations. Those shadows didn't move right. Like I said, instead of them fading away from my light, moving away from my light. They stayed ahead of my light until I passed them. And the best way to describe it, the feeling that came up for me was suddenly a heightened sense of awareness and anxiety rose. It wasn't fear, I wasn't scared, but it was like something was having fun with me. And I was like, you're just psyching yourself out. You're just psyching yourself out. This is nothing. No big deal. You're not doing anything wrong. You're not disturbing the ground. You're traveling your path. You're not going off path, off location. You have no reason to worry about anything. You're doing everything right. And I kept going, and it felt like at a certain point I was feeling like I was trying to outrun something. Like, again, I never saw any actual entity, but something was there. And it stayed with me until I got past a certain point on the road. And like a breath of fresh air, that feeling temporarily stopped. And then it came back, but everything went back to normal. All the shadows and everything were moving the way they were supposed to. Everything looked absolutely normal. But that feeling stayed with me for about 4 days. And it made it hard for me to sleep. I mean, it got so like, I won't mention names, but I'll just say that, and those that know, I typically don't, out of respect, I don't ask certain questions, but this was so heavy on me that I went and asked the medicine man. And I said, hey, there's something that I really need to talk to you about that happened to me in the fields, and I don't know how to handle it. And he looked at me, and he says, he made time for me, and he says, we need to talk. Let's sit down. And what he described to me was, he said he asked me my routine. He asked me what was I doing on location. He asked me what was I doing on the way to and on the way from. He said, sometimes there are, and I believe this personally, he said something that I'd already believed in. He's like, sometimes there are things there that these spirits or entities or whatever you like to refer to them as, sometimes they're there and they are bored. And if you are not right with yourself, is what will give them an opportunity. If you've got a lot on your mind, if you're stressing about something, there's an opportunity. Now, some of them can be very bad and deviant. Some of them can be just mischievous. And his feelings were that I just had something that was mischievous and saw an opportunity to have fun. And it potentially could have just, say, hey, I got one. And like I said, I've heard things before, like in other fields. I'll be working, and typically the sounds of your truck in the dark keep things away from me. But that's my story, and if more happens, I'm more than willing to come back and share it with everyone. I mean, to this day, I don't understand completely what happened. All I know is how the medicine man told me to handle the situation, and he said, for the best part, I did the right thing. I didn't ignore it, but I didn't let it in. So that's my story, and I thank you for giving me the time to share.
Thanks for that, Tony. Like Tony said, that we've been hauling water for so long. We've been on the oil field, and I've been out there, and I gotta say that it's a completely different feeling out there, being on tribal lands, and especially being out there at night. You have this feeling like something is out there watching you. I completely get where Tony's coming from in the story. But as far as the time loss, really, that could hinder on a lot of things, that this, whatever entity was out there, was definitely keeping an eyeball on him and possibly even trying to distort or disorient him. But thank you so much, Tony. It actually harkens back to a lot of stories that I have from my time in the oil field. But like I said, we'll have to save those for another time. So I get it. So I feel you, Tony. I feel you, man. And once again, thank you, Tony, for calling in and regaling us with that story, because like I said, I have a bunch of stories like that maybe one day we'll get to as well. Now, our next story was sent in to the scaryrezstories at gmail.com. It was sent by somebody that goes by the name of Iron Maiden, and it goes like this. Hello, I have a story for you that happened to me in Cheyenne and Arapaho country in Oklahoma. This happened about 14 years ago or so in a small town in western Oklahoma, among where the Cheyenne and Arapahoes live. My boyfriend at the time and I were asleep, and the TV was on at the foot of the bed. I'm not sure what time it was when this event happened, but I know it was in the middle of the night. I was asleep, and as I was sleeping, I felt something heavy on my stomach area. I had a pillow on my stomach and was holding it there as I slept. As I felt this heaviness, I thought to myself, oh, my girls must be back from their grandparents' house. I thought that maybe our grandma had brought our youngest daughter in, as she was still a baby at the time, and had put her on my stomach to wake me up. Well, to my surprise, when I opened my eyes, there was nobody there. I looked over at my boyfriend, and his back was to me, and I could hear him snoring. The only light in the room was from the TV. The next thing, I hear somebody in the bathroom, which was to the left of where I was sleeping. I couldn't really move. I remember looking toward the bathroom and saying, "Who are you? What are you doing? Show yourself." I turned away and tried to wake my boyfriend up by reaching over to shake him, but I was barely able to touch him. Then when I turned my back to look toward the bathroom, there was this person standing there with one of their arms on the dresser, while just staring at me. I couldn't see their face. Their hair was short, like to the shoulders, and kind of hanging in their face. The person had on some type of jersey. I remember feeling scared, and I turned back toward my boyfriend and tried once again to wake him up, but I couldn't. I could barely move my arms. It was like I was paralyzed. After that, I guess I must have fell back to sleep. I woke up the next morning, and as soon as I woke up, I remembered what happened. I told my boyfriend about my dream, or whatever it was, and he got up and burned some cedar around the house. After that experience, I would not sleep on that side of the bed anymore. I hope you find the story somewhat creepy. I sure did. Thank you, KTI. Well, thanks, KTI. It sounds to me like a classic case of sleep paralysis, in which that you tend to find yourself where you can't move. A lot of that is explainable through sort of like sleep apneas and stuff like that, so I definitely suggest getting that checked out. But as far as the creep factor goes of seeing this apparition and seeing it very clearly, it could be the spirit of somebody that you possibly knew, didn't know, maybe somebody that was lingering around the area. I know I've had my run-ins of spirits like this as well, but I don't think I've ever felt paralyzed to that effect. I don't know. Did they look familiar at all? Maybe it could have been one of the members of the community that just passed on and was hanging around. Who knows? Thanks, KTI. As we wrap up this podcast, I want to say again, thank you to everybody that has sent in their stories, called in their stories, and this next story is a very special one because they actually had recorded this from TikTok and had actually given me permission to record the story. So I want to say thank you so much. So without further ado, here's the story.
So this actually just happened to me a few weeks ago. I'm on my way home from a workshop I did about 2 hours west of where I live now. I'm about a half hour away from home. I'm on the highway. I'm all alone, and I see this man walking up ahead. My first thought was hitchhiker, but then I see this car ahead of me. As he's passing this man, the man doesn't put his thumb out. I thought this was a little strange at first, but you know what happens. Then as I'm approaching this man, I notice his description. He has a black cowboy hat, black jean jacket, black jeans, black boots. I'm passing him now. He doesn't put his thumb up for me either, but I thought, you know, he's on the highway. This guy's got to be hitchhiking. So I hit the brakes. And because I hit the brakes last minute, I kind of stopped a ways ahead of him. I looked at my rearview mirror and I noticed he didn't even acknowledge me. He was just walking normal. He didn't get excited as someone was stopping for him. It took him about a whole minute just to arrive to my car. So he gets into the car and he looks at me and he says, "Do you know who I am?" And I thought, you know, I kind of laughed. I was like, "No, I don't know who you are." Then he says again, "But you know me." And I said, "No, I don't know you, man." And I thought maybe he just recognizes me from the area. I don't know. Anyway, so he gets in. He smells like booze, but he doesn't appear to be drunk. He has a strong native accent. Doesn't look native. But the thing that struck me the most odd about him was his eyes, where the white met the eyelids all around the eyes. It was black. And the way he looked at me, he had this really dark look. And then he asks me, do you have $10? And I'm like, you don't even know me, man. I don't know, but I don't have $10. He's like, come on, you got $10 though, right? Give me $10. I said, no, I don't have $10, but you can have my change. I had about $3-4 change. He kind of laughed and he took it. Then I asked him, where are you going? He said, oh, I'm going to Paul Ben. And then he starts laughing. He's like, no, I'm not going to Paul Ben. I'm just joking. I'm not going far from here. I said, well, I just came from Ochis. He's like, oh, but you're going to Edmonton, right? I said, actually, yeah, I am going to Edmonton. And then he says to me, he's like, you see those lights up there? He's like, not these ones, but the next ones. He's like, I'm going to go to that crossroad up there. He's like, but before we get there, can you pull over to the ditch here? I have to lighten my load. He had a backpack with him he wanted to put in the ditch. I thought this was a little odd since he's not going too far. Why would he want to put his bag in the ditch? But I complied. I pulled over. Then he opens the door and he looks at me and he says, you're not going to leave me though, eh? And I said, no, man, I'm not going to leave you. He's like, promise me you're not going to leave me. And I kind of laughed. I was like, I'm not going to leave you, man. And he's like, promise me you're not going to leave. I said, okay, I promise I'm not going to leave. So he gets out of the car and he starts walking into the ditch. I'm watching him. He doesn't stop in the ditch and he keeps walking out the other side of the ditch. I take my eyes off him for a second to look in the rear view because I'm in an unsafe spot. I look back and he's gone. I'm sitting there about 5 minutes. Then I see a cop panel in my rear view coming up. And I'm like, oh man, I don't want to deal with cops right now. I'm parked in an unsafe spot. I just looked over and I said out loud, sorry, man. And I just took off. You know, but these are those stories that you think that would never happen to you. I never got his name, and I still don't know who I picked up.
Thank you so much. Now, that story, like I said, was submitted through TikTok, and I was given permission to use it for this podcast. So thanks once again to Chrissy Yellowbird for submitting that story. Pretty scary stuff. When it comes to picking up hitchhikers, it's always running a risk. But when you run into somebody that tends to strike you and rub you in the wrong way, especially to that effect, it sounds to me like you might have picked up a ghost hitchhiker. Leaves you with a lot of questions of who they are and what happened to them and why they were so insistent on getting money from you. I definitely look forward to listening to more of your TikToks, and hopefully we can add more to the podcast. So once again, thank you to Chrissy Yellowbird for that story. And with that story being told, I think that's going to about wrap us up for the night. I want to thank you, everybody, once again, for sending in your stories, for typing them out, for giving me permission to use them, for calling them in. I am so appreciative. Keep sending in your stories. Remember, I want to know what you've seen, what you heard, what you felt. And when you submit these stories, you can always email them and type them out. Or if you feel like recording them and sending them to me, or through TikTok, or even calling them in. And you can always submit these stories at scaryrezstories@gmail.com. We also have a Facebook page up right now. And all you have to do is search up Scary Stories to Tell from the Rez, and we're right there on Facebook. As well as our YouTube channel currently. I'm so excited to bring you way more stories and to continue this, and hopefully that we get enough going and we can keep telling these stories. But once again, thank you to everybody that has given your stories. I have so many more stories to tell, and I hope to gather more stories from everybody, including you guys, the listeners. So with that being said, how about we put the campfire out tonight? And before we go, just as the old ones used to say, to make sure that nothing follows you home, I ask the Creator to bless you all, so that you may be able to continue on in a good way, so that nothing follows you. I've been your host, Jordan, and thanks for your scary stories. Remember, guys, stay vigilant, stay safe, but most of all, stay scary.